At the king's funeral, the prince saw the humble young woman praying. But when he followed her, he discovered something that... The bourdon bell labored through the stone, a low, solemn pulse that shook dust from the ribs of the vaulted ceiling and settled it on black crepe and bowed heads. Wax hissed as candles grew long tears. The air was dense with incense and damp wool, the scent of beeswax mingling with rain dragged in on every hem. The prince stood beneath the carved canopy reserved for the heir, the weight of 100 formal eyes pressing, the order of grief measured step by step across flagstones. Everything had its place, the choir's psalm like a dark river, the heralds ghosting down the nave with staffs swathed in mourning ribbons, the courtiers arranged as if their sorrow could be read from their alignment. His hands were still, the cut of his coat precise, his jaw clenched just enough to look dignified, not numb. He kept his gaze on the catafalque as duty required. He counted breaths between tolls, found the rhythm that let him stand without swaying when the bell spoke of endings more than words ever could. Yet the ordered world blurred at its edges. Beyond the tapestries and shields, beyond the spill of noble sleeves and the hush of trained piety, someone knelt where no one of standing would kneel, on the cold marble of a side aisle, close to a pillar whose base was smudged with centuries of hands. The prince's eyes slipped once, then returned, then slipped again. A plain gown, a shawl darned close to the shoulder, gloves worn thin at the fingers, a small discolored ribbon trailing from a prayer book held with both hands as if it were the last solid thing in a world suddenly made of water. She did not look up. She did not shift her weight or perform sorrow to be seen. The steadiness of her back, the curve of her head, bowed not to the spectacle, but to someone she had brought with her into silence, pulled at something he had kept trained and tight for years. He could not explain the sense that her grief was truer than any black band or measured step. It did not accuse, it simply existed, quietly, and in existing, it made everything painted and polished seem thin. "Earth to earth," the archbishop intoned, voice riding the cathedral like a well-handled carriage, even and inevitable. "Ashes to ashes." The prince's gaze sprang back to the bier, to the chapel royals, to the ministers lined with faces composed in the particular way power displays loss. He felt the pull of protocol as men in dark coats stepped forward and stepped away. His mother's small movement at the edge of his vision was both command and comfort. He answered with the slight incline of a head that signaled presence, not retreat. He should not look again. He looked again. She had drawn the prayer book closer to her chest, as if something within it had stung or warmed her hand. The ribbon that held place had frayed at its edge. It quivered in the slight draft that moved through the nave as if it were a living thing. Between the pages, near the top where the paper had gone soft from years of handling, a sliver of pale shape lay pressed as thin as breath. A violet, he thought, flattened into a memory, kept when everything else was lost. A flower gathered somewhere. By whom? When? The thought came uninvited and unreasonable, and yet it settled. "Grant him eternal rest," the archbishop said, "and let light perpetual shine upon him." Amen rolled like distant weather. The prince heard his own voice in it and did not recognize it. When the choir answered, the sound drew every line of duty taut again. The procession would move. He would take the steps he had rehearsed in his head all night and all morning, the ones that would show the kingdom that grief could behave itself on a rainy day. He watched as she rose. She did not wait for the aisle to clear. She did not seek the margin of the commoner's way. A glance, quick and almost guilty, slipped to the carved angels that crouched above the side altar. Then she turned, her head still bowed, and moved into the transept as others gathered themselves into the tide flowing toward the west doors. The prince's breath stuck in his throat for a beat. It should have ended for him there, at observation, at a curious note for the mind to strike later, when the day was his to mull. Instead, impulse surged up with an authority that made sense only in the moment. He stepped down from the canopy's shadow, his pace steady enough to look like duty, his eyes fixed on the path she had taken. A verger saw him angle away and hesitated. The man's rattle quieted in his hand. His mouth opened to direct the air back to the prescribed route. "I will go by the transept," the prince said, low, even. It sounded like a decision already cleared. "Your Royal High." The verger swallowed what would have been proper, dipped his head instead. "As you wish, sir." He moved along the aisle opposite the procession's flow, letting the great spinal column of ceremony pass by while he navigated the ribs. The candles on the side altars had burned to clots, crusted with salt lines where wax had cooled. He slipped past a lady whose veil had caught on a carved finial and paused long enough to lift the fabric free without drawing eyes. The door to the lesser transept creaked on hinges that had not seen oil in a season. Cold breath wrapped his face, the cathedral's lungs exhaling. Ahead, the impression of her remained. The brief flutter of dark cloth passing a window mottled with age. The faintest scrape of the sole of a well-worn shoe. He slipped into a corridor reserved for vergers and choristers, where the stone floor was chalked with the edges of old sundries, and the air tasted of old paper and coal. The hum of the great body of mourners receded. The sound became the prince's own breathing, the bell still in his bones. She stood before a small door bound in old oak. A side chapel lay within, the kind that was used when the big machine of the cathedral did not need to turn, a place for quiet masses and private pleas. She rested her palm flat against the wood and breathed once, twice, as if gathering words. Then she slipped in. He stopped at the threshold and watched. The chapel smelled of cold stone, beeswax that had failed to scent the air entirely, and iron damp. 2 brass candlesticks leaned slightly, each compensating for a floor that had never forgiven its mason. The altar was a simple block of wood, dressed in linen. No one had bothered with flowers. She knelt, not at the rail, but on the first bare slab of pavement, where the marks of decades of knees had worn a softness into the surface. The prayer book rested on her lap. As she bent her head, the ribbons slid, and the pages opened part way. The pressed violet showed its ghosted shape. Beneath its delicate outline, something else peered out. A folded sheet, thicker than paper, with the faint shine of vellum. Sealing wax, dark and whole, pebbled its edge. The impression in it startled the prince like a hand on his forearm. He knew that seal. Not the great device that accompanied acts of state. Not the common crest used for invitations and announcements. This was the private signet belonging to the dead, kept close for matters that did not pass through public rooms. He had seen it only in a handful of moments when duty had been set aside and father had been allowed to be father. The wax never lied, and it had not cracked. Whoever had handled that fold had done so with care bordering on reverence. He should leave. He should call for a verger. He should rejoin the procession. He should tamp down this spark of the improper. He did not move. From this angle, the seal caught a scrap of light and gave it back in a dull glint. She lifted her face without raising her head. Her lips moved. He could not catch the words at first. He leaned a fraction closer, let the sound thread the cold between them. "Give me courage," she whispered. Or, "Forgive my fear." The two possibilities, the serenity of courage, the humility of fear, wove the room tighter around him. He did not think he had ever heard a plea without an agenda. It did not feel like intrusion to listen. It felt like witnessing something unrepeatable. She touched the edge of the vellum with the back of one finger, not daring the seal, and the ribbon snagged on the roughness of her glove, pitched, tore. A thread of it fluttered to the floor. She started, almost too small a movement to be called a start. The candle flame guttered with a draft that seeped through somewhere high and narrow. The prayer book closed on the folded sheet with a small thud like a heart's second beat. She rose, gathering the book to her, and turned for a door to the right, the one that led past the vestry and into the warren of narrow back passages. She did not look behind her. A slip of ribbon clung to the arch of her heel. When she passed the sill, it snagged and released, fell quietly onto the stone like a shed thing. The prince crossed the threshold and picked up the thread, trivial, ridiculous, and yet proof that he had not dreamed any of it. He tucked it into his glove as if he were accountable for it. The chill of the passage hit the skin at his neck. He followed her, keeping his steps soft to manage the echo that would otherwise announce him like brass. The vestry doors were propped to admit the scents and movements of the day, the trace of polish, the fug of wet cloth, the lingering sourness of old wool. Songbooks lay in neat stacks, tied with ribbon, edges frayed to gray. An ancient robe hung by its hem from a peg that should have been retired. He passed a window glazed with cheap, wavy glass and saw only the wash of rain. The service yard beyond waited like the space behind a stage, full of signs of labor that never make it into paintings. At the end of the passage, a narrow gate stood ajar. Iron had rusted around its latch in a ring, a small orange flower on black. The prince set his palm lightly to the wood and eased it open. The yard was empty, save for rain puddling beneath a tilted cart, a sweep leaning in a corner, and a stack of sandbins topped with a wide board that had become a bench by neglect. The alley beyond was a slit of dull light between heavy stone. He stepped out. The rain's finest particles needled his face and vanished into the wool at his collar. His boots found the film of water that earned every cobblestone its shine. He paused to listen. The great bell had fallen silent. For a moment, the world seemed to be holding its breath. From the alley opposite, a shadow pulled itself free of the wall. It was not a trick of light. The figure, indistinct but too solid to be missed, waited, the stillness of a man who watches rather than hides. The line of the coat, the shape of the shoulders did not suggest a laborer from this quarter. The prince did not move. The figure did not either. Then, as if the pause had fulfilled its purpose, the man turned, took 2 easy paces, and disappeared down the alley without hurry, as if he had come only to confirm that the wrong person had taken the right path. The prince crossed to the alley mouth and looked both ways. The city's backways breathed smoke and damp. A cat leaped, startled, from a windowsill and scolded him with its eyes. A heap of vegetable leaves sat broken against a step where a kitchen door had opened and closed 100 times. He listened for the woman's tread, but heard only the drip of eaves and the far-off change of the guard shouted at a distance that turned it into rumor. He was about to choose a direction when something under his boot shifted. He looked down. On the flagstones, the small torn piece of ribbon from the prayer book lay water-dark but recognizable, its thread caught on a splinter in the stone. Beyond it, in the thin sheen on the ground, footprints began and led away. 2 sets, close enough together to tempt confusion, but different in their language. One was small, the pressure points sharp at toe and heel, quick in the way the splash arced. The other carried weight, the edges fuzzed by the crush of a heavier sole, the stride longer and indifferent to puddles. "Wait," he whispered, to no one and to the moment itself. He had the ridiculous thought that if time would pause for his word, he could lay the 2 tracks on paper and read their character as if reading letters formed by 2 different hands. He crouched for a closer look, the wool of his coat brushing moisture from the cart's wheel. The small prince hugged the wall, choosing the narrow parts where an overhanging gallery kept the ground drier. The heavy prince moved down the center, where the rain made a mirror of the alley. He imagined the small ones slipping between the ordinary obstacles of poor quarters the way someone slips through habit. He imagined the heavy ones never needing to cheat space, confident that no one would question their right to the middle. The image put a taste in his mouth he did not like. He could not pursue both. His body knew which it would choose before his mind granted it permission. The small, quick, humble path called to something he would not name in the open, the part of him that looked for what was true under what was grand. Yet the weight of the other threatened in a different way. Not just danger to himself, but danger to the unwatched woman who had pressed her life into a prayer book that had no business holding a private seal. Behind him, the gate complained against its hinge and settled. He turned his head. No one. The courtyard had not changed. He straightened slowly, wiping rain from his jaw. He could feel the pull of the cathedral at his back, the collapsed space where the catafalque had stood, the space already being filled by arrangements and lists and the work of the living. He could feel eyes that were not here and would nonetheless speak if he failed to be in the right place when the last formal bow had to be made. He moved forward into the alley's mouth and paused where the tracks widened under the open sky. "Which are you?" he murmured, and surprised himself with the question. "Which are you tonight?" The rain did not answer. It polished the stones and made the world clean and treacherous at the same time. He tucked his gloved hand tighter around the small thread of ribbon, an object that should have meant nothing, and let it anchor him in this strange, inexplicable pursuit that was fast becoming a choice with a shape. A voice drifted from the street beyond, not speaking words so much as floating sound. A watchman's rattle clacked twice, then fell quiet, impatient. Somewhere a shutter banged and thudded back into place. The smell of coal smoke thickened, and then slipped away with a change in wind. He looked once more at the small prints skirting dryness, and at the heavy ones striding down the middle. He took a breath, stepped to commit, and saw, clearest now because he was willing to see, the small, quick prints cross the path of the heavier set and burst toward a narrow waste between two cottages, where only a slender shoulder would pass, while the heavier set angled to cut off a different course, one that would lead him back toward the main street and the wider light. He set his weight forward, ready to choose, when the shadow he had seen detach earlier reappeared at the far corner and lifted a hand in a gesture that could have been greeting or warning or neither, and the prince understood that he was not the only one reading the ground tonight, not the only one following a young woman whose prayer book held a seal that should never have left a royal hand. For a heartbeat he considered shouting. The alley gave him back his own breath and the light slap of rain, nothing else. He stepped toward the narrower path, where the smaller footprints braided along the wall, and the world tightened into that choice. He moved, quick and quiet, body angled as if he were pressing himself into the city without leaving a ridge for anyone to catch. She had chosen the sliver of space between two cottages, the kind of pinch in the masonry children learned and grown people forgot. He slipped through after her and felt brick rasp his shoulders. A courtyard opened like a small held breath. Pump at center, shuttered windows like closed eyes, a string of washing abandoned to weather. He saw her then, a few paces ahead, pausing with one hand on the pump handle, head turning in the small, sharp way of someone mapping routes that are more instinct than plan. "Stop," he said, not loud. The word rode the air on its own weight. She went still. Her shoulders tightened, then eased. She did not turn fully. The angle of her face let him see the line of cheek and the glimmer of rain caught on her lashes. The prayer book rested against her shawl, tucked in the bend of her elbow, ribbon trailing. He saw the shape of the seal in his mind, wax dark and unbroken, that impossible device sitting in a poor hand. "You came after me," she said, voice clear, pitched to carry without seeming bold. "You shouldn't have. Nor should you have had what you carry." He moved another step into the court. He kept his hands low, open. "Where did you come by that seal?" Her mouth pressed together, a quick, fierce refusal that was almost a smile in another life. "The seal is nothing to you. It is everything to me." The admission was quiet and had too much truth in it. He wanted to take it back and tasted how little control he had over the words he most meant. "I saw it." "You saw nothing," she said, softer, and the wind pushed the ribbon against her wrist like a small, desperate thing. "Let me go my way. Go yours." "We are entangled," he said. "That book says so." She flicked her gaze to the pump, and then to the alley beyond it, calculating. "Then untangle yourself. It is simpler for you than for me." Something in the tilt of her chin put heat under his cooled skin. The bell's weight still sat along his spine. Duty and loss had stiffened him into the man the country required. This woman's poise, poverty tied up neatly under a shawl, the faith she had carried into a cathedral where her hands would be overlooked even as they reached for God, knocked something loose inside him. "Who are you?" he asked. "No one," she said. and the speed of the answer made it true and unbearable at once. "Then why did you pray like someone who expects to be heard?" She did turn then. Her eyes met his. The rain made jewels of her lashes. It should have been ordinary, a poor girl's face in a poor court with a prince out of place. The space between them narrowed until he could feel the heat of her breath crossing the cool yard. For a moment the world held, no future, no court, just the stubborn fact of two people standing in the rain with a force running under their brief exchange that made no sense and made all the sense there was. "Because I needed to be," she said. "And need is not a crime. It is when it holds something that belongs to the crown. Does truth belong to the crown?" Her voice didn't lift, didn't accuse. It laid the question down like a plank over water and stood back to see if he would walk it. He had no answer that wasn't a confession. From the alley beyond, a small sound cut the air, the scrape of a boot where no one had reason to let leather speak. They both turned their heads in the same instant. The shadow he had seen before had found a better place to watch. He felt the raw, ugly tug of politics coming for him like a net. "Give me the book," he said, before the net fell. "I will keep you safe." "You cannot promise that," she said. "Not for me." Her gaze slid to his collar, to the exact edge where duty had been cut to fit a body that had never been free. "Perhaps not even for yourself. Trust me. I do not know you." "Edward," he said. And the name worked its strange private magic when spoken by his own mouth without title. "My name is Edward." Her breath caught. She understood exactly what he had given her by stripping the honorifics away. She understood what it would cost her to treat him like a man and not a figure. Her fingers tightened on the prayer book. "You cannot unmake what you are," she said, a warning to both of them. "Nor can you," he said. Her mouth trembled. Not tears, he felt relieved by the lack of them. What flickered there was decision. He saw it the way a rider sees a horse gather itself before the jump. "Forgive me," she whispered, and moved. It was not flight in panic. It was obedience to a plan she had made with places, not with people. She slipped behind the pump, along a narrow run between a wall and a shoulder-high stack of broken crates, and out into a lane where the chandler's sign swung and squealed. He followed with care, quick as he could without letting his boots announce him like symbols. The seam of the city opened to him like a book written in trades. Chandler, Cooper, Hosier. He read her path by the bits she left, a scuff where a brick jutted, a small smear of coal on the hem that had not been there in the chapel. "Stop," he called once more when the lane narrowed so much that his voice would not carry. "No," she said, breath just ahead of him. It sounded more like a prayer than a refusal. "Not here." They cut through a passage under a sagging gallery where a cat leaped onto a barrel and swore in its own language. A night watchman rattled his clacker and muttered something about the hour to an empty street. A window opened somewhere and shut harder than necessary. The world had returned to its habit, and they were two bodies moving through it in defiance of that ease. Her foot slid on a film of rain. The prayer book flew from her arm, pages fanning, the pressed violet trembling along a crease like a heart still trying to keep a rhythm. She snatched for it, caught it clumsily, clutched it to her. A single folded sheet, the vellum, shot from between the pages and skidded like a small boat into a shallow puddle. He was close enough now to see the wax catch the poor light. He stepped in, bent, and plucked it from the water before it could take so much as a rim of damp. His gloves felt the weight and slickness that separates vellum from paper. He saw the imprint and knew it before his gut told him, Private Royal Seal. The lines were exact, the depth of the impression, the way the wax had received it with no crumble, spoke of careful hands and a desk free of drafts. "Give it," she said, at his shoulder now, voice low and fierce. She reached, checked herself, because to snatch would make a sound that drew the street to them, and not to snatch meant she had to stand within him and let their breaths mix. "Please." He held it still, eyes on her. Some madness moved through him, a desire to say the simplest thing and have it be enough. Tell me, and I will carry half. He had never said such a thing to anyone without expecting to be obeyed. He could see how that expectation lived in the set of his shoulders, even when he spoke soft. He lowered the vellum a fraction, not in surrender, but to feel the air between their hands change, as if the letter had its own weather. I recognized the seal, he said. You know I did. She swallowed. The ribbon on the prayer book shook against her wrist. I know what I carry. You cannot, he began, and then stopped, because who was he to tell anyone what they could or could not bear? He changed the sentence as it formed. Not alone. Her laugh was short and without joy. There is no other way for me. There is, he said. Your way, she said, which is not mine. He should have argued. He should have set the world to rights with the privilege that had always opened rooms. But all he could think of was the look on her face in the chapel and the thin pressed flower between pages, and how anything fragile can also be enduring if it is kept close and kept dry. And maybe she had kept this letter in the safest way anyone could. Someone watches us, he said, letting the tactical truth break the impasse. From the court. I know, she said. No tremor, no show of fear. It was part of her plan, too. They have watched me for days. His throat went dry. The idea of her being followed through alleys with a royal seal against her heart brought up an anger that felt like an old nerve laid bare. Why come to the cathedral, then? To be seen, she said, by the only person who might choose differently. Her eyes flicked to his and away. Or to say goodbye, if that is not possible. His name was an absence on her tongue. He felt the odd privilege of it. He folded the letter into his cloak, beneath the lapel, where it would not be kissed by rain. He did not break the seal. The restraint hurt, like gripping a hilt without drawing. He stepped back to give her space the way a gentleman steps back to allow the lane to flow, but it was not courtesy. It was acknowledgement. Where will you go? He asked. Not where you can follow, she said, and for a flicker he saw the regret in it, as clearly as he had seen the pressed violet. They will trap you more easily than me. He smiled, involuntary, at the idea that she believed herself less trappable. You do not know the traps built for me. I know the ones built for me, she said, and that you make a bigger noise when you fall into yours. A shape at the far end of the lane shifted, his watcher changing position. Her gaze snared on the movement and then cut back to him, warning in it. Go, he said. I give you my word I will not call the watch. You would not need to, she said, meaning his very presence could call it. Then, because she was not unkind even now. Thank you. He let his hand open. He had meant it as proof. It felt like letting go of the very thing that proved him human, and not just a crown on legs. She moved past him, close enough that her shawl dampened his sleeve, and the edges of his breath tangled into the wool. For a moment, the scent of her, soap and rain, and the faintest trace of candle smoke, settled on his skin. Not perfume, nothing manufactured to be desired. Simply the truth of a person. She vanished mid-lane by leaning into the sort of narrow slice in a street that only someone who lived by them saw. He almost smiled at the artistry. Then he remembered the shadow waiting for him and did not. He took 2 quick steps after her, found the slice himself, edged through, and emerged into a tradesman's court warming into the day's late business. A barrow stacked with onions curtained with burlap, a boy knocking mud from a cart's wheel with a stick, a woman beating a rug as if it had insulted her. The city did not care for secrets except as currency. He held the secret under his coat and felt the way it burned even through cloth. A man turned into the court and stopped when he saw him. The cut of the coat, the polish of the boots, the way the hat sat like authority itself, none of it belonged here. He wasn't the courtier himself. He was the sort of man who stood just behind such a one and did not speak unless needed. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He just looked, as if counting what he saw so he could sell it for the best price later. "You're far from where you ought to be," the prince said, too quietly for the boy and the woman to hear. "Am I?" the man said, voice flat. He did not move. He did not pretend innocence. He did not pretend guilt. He was the shape of consequence in a coat that had seen good tailoring and worse acts. The prince turned away as if the man were not worth a second glance. It cost him to do it. He walked out of the court on a line he hoped looked aimless and felt surgical. He kept the letter close enough to feel against his ribs, where every bell strike from earlier found its echo. He tried to think like a man who had not been raised with a door thrown open at every forward step. He did not head straight to the broader streets. He let the map he had made earlier guide him down the smaller ways, under the low stoops, across the uneven, into and out of the places where the city dyes its hands with its own labor. He saw hints of her, a damp edge of shawl wool caught on a splinter, the smallest smudge of wax on brick where her book had brushed. The signs she left felt like a conversation she was having with space, and he was only allowed to overhear. He came upon the book in that way. He did not expect it, and had been expecting it all along. It lay on the step of a back door, face down, ribbon sopping, pressed flower clinging despite damp. His heart jumped. He looked up, down, all around. The door was shut. The window above it was curtained. He reached, lifted the book. It was heavier by so little it could be deception, but he felt at once what was missing. Not the violet, not the ribbon, the space the vellum had left behind. The gap where importance had been and now wasn't. He held the book and smoothed the ribbon between finger and thumb even as water dripped from it in thin, defeated lines. "Clara," he said, first time he had said her name out loud, the letters strange in his mouth because he had learned them only by hearing her unname herself a moment before. No answer. No shape in any shadow. He opened the book just enough to see that the vellum was truly gone. He did not see which way it had flown, only that it had. He closed the book and tucked it under his arm where it would not be in danger again. He didn't like the idea of separating it from the letter. He also knew the letter had to be kept from view. The watchman's rattle shook again, closer. Voices bumped down the lane as if the rain had disturbed them loose. He heard the word constable and felt the way it struck at the heart of everything he had been taught. To be seen here by the wrong person would be to turn a private crisis into a public one before he even knew what he held. He stepped into the shelter of a narrow awning that smelled of stale tallow and looked out onto the next court. A lantern flared at its edge, lifted high by a hand eager to turn light into power, a voice cutting the rain to call the constables, just as the shadow at the corner raised a hand to beckon others toward the sight of the heir to the throne, standing alone in the lanes with the late king's sealed letter pressed beneath his cloak. The lantern's flare blew out the shadows and made him a figure. The call for constables broke whatever cover the rain had given. He did not run. Running made noise. He slid along the awning's edge, found the seam where the eaves met a crooked stair, and pressed himself into the angle as a pair of watchmen clattered past, breath white in the damp. "Who called?" one barked. "Lantern at the court," the other answered, eager to be first at the sight. "Said there was gentry where there oughtn't be." Their boots hammered away. He waited, counted to 10, heard only the soft complaint of a swinging sign. The alley inhaled again. The flare had dropped to a pale, mean light farther down. The man who had signaled now leaned as if carved to the corner. He had done what he came to do. He would go and do it again, somewhere else. The prince stepped deeper under the broken stair. The space was dry by a miracle of bad carpentry. He took out the folded vellum. His hands were steady, too steady. When he eased a fingernail under the wax, the seal broke with a sound that made his throat work. He lifted the flap and breathed in the old smell of vellum and tallow, a scent that belonged to winter lamplight and private rooms, not alleys. The hand was his father's, tight economical letters, flourished only at the first line, as if the pen had needed a moment to warm. Names, sums, dates that fitted against a calendar he carried in mind, because governance had taught him to hold years like rows in a ledger. A second slip, thin, fell to his palm. It carried a list with annotations in another, smaller script. Clerk's hand, loyal and fast. He read, and the alley, its puddles, its spills, thinned to the narrow tunnel of the words. Clara Whitlow's father had been trusted in that last long season. He had made fair copies of memoranda that did not pass through the official books. He had kept track where the privy purse blurred into charity. He had followed numbered lines that went out into the world and did not come back bearing the right weight. And at the bottom of the last page, in his father's own hand, a line that struck him with more force than any number: to be kept from the child, until fit to bear it. The word child had no need of a name. It dissolved the distance between office and family in a single stroke. He closed his eyes and saw his father as he had been when the door was shut and the great devices were put away. A man, not a system. A father who had chosen to wait and had hidden the weight in the hands of a clerk. A quiet man with a clear script, and, it seemed, a daughter who had learned his neatness. He folded the sheets with care and slid them back into their sheath inside his coat. The wax lay in a crescent on the stair at his feet. He picked it up and pocketed it, as if a fragment of seal could still confer trust. He took the prayer book from under his arm, felt the featherweight of the pressed violet inside, and looked up. The alley was as it had been, and not. It contained choices now. He could head for the palace and pull the machine of state around him like armor, or he could follow the seam of this night until it told him where she slept. He pictured the small prince hugging dryness, the scuff he had noticed on a low door jamb in the mews, the quiet way she had used space. He left the shelter and moved through the alleys with that map under his skin. A dog barked twice, then fell back into the sleep of animals born to noise. A shutter cracked open and shut with a disgusted little snap. He turned where she had turned, kept to the shade of a sagging gallery, crossed a tight court that smelled of cabbage water gone sour. He slowed at a narrow door set back beneath an overhang, its hinge scraped bright as if lifted often to keep it from complaining. He touched the latch with 2 fingers and pushed. The room spoke of someone who had learned to live small, without letting smallness turn sour. A single bed beneath a tiny window, a table near the stove, its surface rubbed pale where hands had loved it into cleanliness. A shawl, damp, laid to dry. He stepped in and closed the door without letting the latch fall. The prayer book had left his arm. It rested on the table now, ribbon untidy. He set his palm on it, then removed his hand, as if reassured by contact and ashamed of needing it. He wanted to call her name. He had only said it once into damp air that did not answer. He let silence tell her he was here. The scrape of a shoe in the passage. Breath held, released. The door did not open at once. It paused. A soft tap, enough to count as courtesy. She entered with her head slightly turned, listening more than looking, as if she had taught herself to read dangers the way other people read pages. When she saw him, the readjustment of her face, fear, anger, resolve, happened so quietly, it would have escaped anyone not watching for it. "You brought it," she said. She glanced at the prayer book, and then at his coat where the letter lived. "Or you only brought half." "The seal is broken," he said. He didn't dress the truth in excuses. "I could not carry blindness longer than I had to." "I know what it says," she answered. And that admission made the room smaller, made the air truer. "Then we can speak without invention," he said. She crossed to the stove and set a kettle on, as if to create a sound that belonged to normal life. It made a thin metallic complaint, and then settled. She warmed her hands on its side and said nothing else. He was not used to being required to begin. He did it anyway. "Your father served my father," he said. "Quietly, when my father had no strength for public storms. He put numbers where there were shadows. He found what should shame us all." Her head turned. She faced him fully then. The candle on the shelf picked out the damp on the ends of her hair, where the shawl did not cover. He found what men with better names than his took for themselves, and hid behind words like necessity and confusion. Names, he said. The letter has them. I know, she said again. Her gaze dropped briefly to the prayer book's ribbon. They have known, I know. How many have come to your door? Enough to teach me to sleep light, she answered. Not enough to make me give what is not mine to give. He moved a little nearer. The room accepted him or suffered him. He could not tell which. Whose is it then, if not yours and mine? The truth? She lifted one shoulder, not careless, if anything, careful with the scope of her words. It belongs to the ones who are owed it, and to the man who meant to carry it when he could. She looked at his face with a steadiness that was almost kindness. You. The word landed between them with a weight that was not accusation. It made it harder to speak and easier to be honest. I am seen, he said. In the lanes tonight. Men whose business is to carry news quickly have taken mine up like a parcel. He heard how it sounded. He pushed on. It will reach the palace before I do. It will be believed, she said. It will be measured, he corrected, by eyes trained to find the smallest weakness in a well-made case. Her mouth tightened, because that was not untrue and not kind. He reached into his coat and brought out the letter and the list with its smaller hand. He laid them on the table like a surgeon putting down tools. She did not touch them. She took a breath and lifted the prayer book instead, its familiar weight offering something steadier than paper that could change the room's temperature with a single line of ink. Your father wrote the instruction at the foot, he said, quieter now that the words were near. To be kept from the child until fit to bear it. She nodded once. He said your father asked him to in case, if there was no right moment before the end to put it into your hands. He trusted him. He had his reasons. The kettle began to whisper. She removed it from the heat without letting it boil. The room settled. Outside, rain argued with the sill in a steady small tapping, a clock not of men's making. Men have tried to buy it, she said, as if the kettle had given her permission to add what needed adding. They do not offer money. They offer comfort, a place for me, work. They say the world is too hard for a girl with no father's house. Are they wrong? He asked gently. Yes, she said, and the word wore a coat of grief. But they are also right. She set the kettle back onto the stove. They want the quiet more than they want justice. And you? I want my father not to be called thief or fool when he is not here to answer back, she said. I want to sleep without counting shadows. She glanced at the letter again, as if it might change its words if she looked often enough. I want whatever your father wanted when he wrote to you, and could not bring himself to give the letter then. He did not reach for her hand, because that would be too easy and too much. He reached for steadiness instead. Then you and I want, in essence, the same thing. She gave him a look that sounded like a laugh without making a sound. Do we? You want truth wrapped and carried by the right hands. I want it to stop knocking at my door. It has knocked at mine all my life, he said. That is not the same knock, she answered, but there was no sting in it. Yours asks you to sit straighter. Mine asks me to move house. He allowed himself one quick, dry smile at the precision. Then a soft scrape issued from the passage beyond the door, the sound of something being slid. They both turned. A square of folded card edged itself under the door, as if pushed by a cautious fingertip, then withdrew without the courtesy of a knock. She looked to him for permission. He crossed the few steps and picked it up. The paper was thick and unscented, no seal on the outside. He opened it with his thumb and saw the spare hand he knew intimately. His mother's pen made little of flourish. She wrote only when necessary, and necessity made her letters short. Seen in the city. Return with discretion. Appearances. He folded it again. He did not need to show it for her to know. But he held it out anyway, and let her look at the letters as if they were a drawing of the life he had never truly chosen, and could never now put down. "She asks you to leave," she said. "She reminds me that people who never sleep have started their day early," he said, "and that I belong to them." "Do you?" she asked, and the question was not challenge so much as invitation to state what mattered in the next breath. He listened to the passage. It had gone quiet again. He could imagine how the note had arrived, slid by a hand that would never tell a soul. A palace could find its way into any room in the city when it had to. "If I leave," he said, "they will build stories in the space I leave behind. And if you stay," she said, "they will build different ones. The fact is the same. The story is not," he said, and was immediately aware that he had said something too close to habit. She let him hear how it sounded. Spoken like a man who has lived among careful tellings. "What would you have me speak like?" he asked, and it was not sharp. It was a question he wanted answered. "As yourself," she said, and gave a small, almost embarrassed shake of her head, as if that were a foolish request, and she knew it. He looked around the room. The stove's heat had taken the damp out of the shawl. The window latch had been mended with a bit of bent wire. The hinge sockets on the door were old, cracked where the wood had dried badly one summer and taken on rain ever since. He took those details into him not as catalogue, but as a way to stand where she stood. "I will be seen with you or without you tonight," he said. "I would prefer it be with you." She rested a hand on the table to steady something in herself that had nothing to do with balance. "There were days when I imagined the crown as a hall with no doors for people like me," she said, "and nights when I thought perhaps doors are just painted to look like walls. Tonight," he said, "we have found a hinge." She breathed in, breathed out. The kettle gave one reluctant, complaining bubble, and then submitted to being quiet again. She moved a half-step nearer. The room felt sudden, small. He could see where a lock of her hair had stuck to her temple and then dried there, a small crescent like a letter he could not read. "What will you do?" she asked. "Act," he said. "That is not an answer," she said gently. "It is the only one I have with honor in it," he said. He put his fingers on the edge of the table, because if he put them anywhere else, they would do something they had no permission to do. "I will not ask you to hand anything over tonight. I will ask that you allow me to stand between you and whatever knocks next." "What knocks next?" she began, and then stopped, head cocked. He heard it as she did. The shift of breath in the passage, the drag of a sleeve against rough plaster, the scuff of a soul that tried to be quiet and failed by a thread. He shook his head once at her and took 2 steps to the window. He lifted the little trunk beneath it by its rope handles and set it aside, tested the latch with his thumb. It stuck and then gave, reluctantly, telling him it would open if forced, but not willingly. The door's bar, simple and old, lay in its sockets. He set it, felt the crack in the right-hand socket yield a millimeter under pressure. He met her eyes. She nodded, Lena-like, but he had never known her name and would not give her a wrong one. His mind corrected itself. Clara. She picked up the prayer book, not for evidence, not for comfort, but because it was hers, and because people who have carried a thing long will carry it into any room where decisions are made. "Do not make a sound," he said, barely moving his mouth. "I will not," she said, and her voice, down to a pebble now, did not shake. The door latch lifted without rattle, and the bar bowed in its cracked sockets as the first man pressed the wood inward, and the second set his shoulder to it with a quiet that meant they had done this often, and preferred not to be dramatic, and the hinge pins sighed as the old wood began to split. The bar bowed. Wood cried out in a strained whisper. The hinge pins shivered in their mortices like teeth in a cold mouth. Edward's palm slid under the sash. The swollen wood grudged him room, then gave with a muffled crack. Damp air leaned through the gap. He looked to Clara. She already had the prayer book against her breast, ribbons snagged at her wrist. No panic. Her eyes took him in, The window, the door, the cheap bar with the split socket, and answered without questions. She crossed the room on the balls of her feet, skirts gathered in one hand to clear them from the sill. "Go," he mouthed. She shook her head once. No. The smallest refusal, all will. "You first," she breathed, and touched the frame where his hands worked, as if adding her steadiness could keep the sash from rattling. The door bulged. The bar bent another inch. The crack in the right-hand socket ran a thin line down the weathered grain. He put a knee on the trunk and levered himself through the frame. Brick scraped his shoulder. Damp bit through cloth. He dropped into the yard on bent legs, boots splashing. The rain had eased to needles. The ground smelled of ash and cabbage water. He turned back, hands up, ready. She set the prayer book across the sill like a child once lifted at a low wall, then swung her legs after it. He took her weight. For a second she was entirely in his arms, and the world shrank to the shift of muscle and the heavy quiet of being trusted. Then her feet found the ground. She bent to snatch the book, and he eased her behind him toward the wall. The door gave. Wood splintered. A shoulder forced itself through space that did not want it. A boot scuffed over the threshold. Voices low and practiced. "There's back windows." "Right. Quiet." Edward ran. They moved along the yard's edge under the stale shelter of a leaning awning. A gate held by twine, and a nail blocked them. Clara's fingers went to the knot, untied it cleanly in one pull, drew the nail with a bit of wire she took from the cuff of her sleeve. The gate whispered open. They slipped through and drew it shut without slam. Beyond lay the narrow path behind the cooper's yard, staves stacked high and round, as if the world were made entirely of half-built barrels. The smell of wood shavings and damp oak soaked the air. Clara threaded them through the maze as if she had been born inside it. He kept his body to her line and his ear to the back of the yard. A voice behind them in the first yard, now muted by rain and wood. Out the back. Gate. Find the lane. They reached the wall. It was knee-high and slick. Clara set her palm, pressed, and went over in a low arc. He followed, his coat snagging for a heartbeat on a splinter, and freeing with a sound that made his teeth ache. A narrow canal ran on the other side, dark water working around a bend. A footbridge crossed, rough planks, shiny with rain. She took the bridge on its edges where the wood held better. The planks flexed once under both of them. He felt the way fear can be a live thing in a board. Then they were over and at a door that had no business being a door to anyone who did not know it. A laundry's drying room stood quiet, 4 walls and a roof. No reason to be open at this hour. A latch of simple iron kept it. Clara slipped the hairpin from beneath her shawl, eased it under the loop, teased, twisted. The latch lifted with the patience of iron giving way to a hand that understood it. She pushed the door with her shoulder and let them in, closing it as if closing a page between them and the men in the yard. The room smelled of lye soap and damp cloth. Ropes crisscrossed under the rafters. Wooden pegs held empty lines taut. The floor carried old stains in a language of work. A small pane high on one wall let in rain light and the hum of the city at the edges. He listened. The canal took their sounds and dulled them. Staves did what wood always does, kept its counsel. The men's voices smudged out. Clara stood with her back to the door for a breath and looked at the lines overhead, the pegs, the little square of light. She pushed a stray piece of hair behind her ear with the fingers that weren't holding the prayer book. "This is safe?" he asked. "For the moment," she said. "I have used it to hide things less precious than a crown's disgrace." He let that sit, heavy and exact. He slid the bolt across the door in a way that would not carry and moved to the center of the room. His coat steamed. The letter pressed a steady reminder against his ribs. The hum at his temples had not lessened since the cathedral. She set the prayer book on a workbench under the high window and laid her palm on it as if quieting an animal. The ribbon, damp, glued itself for a beat to the wood and then released. The pressed violet held its shape, a dune of a memory that had refused to be flattened into nothing. "Tell me," he said. She met his eyes. The drying room's poor light made everything honest. "You have read some." "I have," he said. "Enough to know names and numbers and a purpose I do not want to believe in." She drew in a breath that tried not to sound like a shiver. "Then you should know the rest before you decide anything." He said nothing. She took his silence as permission and opened the prayer book. The vellum was not inside now. He had it in his coat. She did not ask. She turned a page and showed him what sat behind. Not the king's hand, but her father's. Neat copies, the ink slightly faded, the lines without flourish. Receipts recast for clarity. Dates paired with initials. A column of figures and, in the margin, a few words that took the numbers out of abstraction and pressed them into the soft flesh of government. "The money," she said, keeping her voice level, "was not only stolen to line coats. It was marshaled, gathered to purchase silence and loyalty in the months when the court began to fret about what would happen if your father's mind wandered where his counsel could not follow." He flinched, not visibly, the kind of recoil trained into becoming still. "They feared," she continued, softer for the wound she had just laid open, "and in their fear some of them planned to take more than charity. They plotted to shape the regency to their hand if your father could no longer hold the center, to turn the council to a pattern that served them and not the realm. The money ran through tradesmen and charities and found its way into pockets that would vote correctly, that would make the right phrases at the right dinners, that would nod at the right moments." "A net," he said. She nodded. "And a net can become a wall if no one sees it." He moved one hand along a drying line, feeling the roughness of the rope under his palm. He followed it to a wooden peg and back, as if the line could tell him something about tension that his own bones could not. "Were they going to move against me?" he asked. "Or only around me?" She let the quiet respect the difference. "Around," she said. "That was my father's fear and his comfort. Around, not against. To hem you in. To claim they were preserving order while making you so safe you could not reach the door." He thought of his mother's note, appearances, and the terrible usefulness of a phrase like that. He thought of rooms he had been ushered into and out of for years, how a door can be held open in a way that chooses where a man goes and thinks he chose it himself. "And the succession," he said, careful with the word because it was made of both law and blood. "They called it prudence," she answered. "They moved men into place who would whisper about your youth, about grief, about the need for steady hands. They wanted a regency that lasted as long as their accounts required. They did not need to take the crown. They needed to take the rooms around it." He closed his eyes. The laundry line swung a finger's width in a wind that did not reach the floor. It looked like hesitation made visible. "And you," he said, opening his eyes again, "were to hold this in a poor room while they arranged chairs in gilded ones." "My father asked me to hold," she said. "He said I would know when to carry it, where it could not be ignored. He believed, simple as it sounds, that truth, when it is finally put in the right place, does its work." "Do you believe that?" he asked. She looked up at the little window. Rain wrote a brief line down the pane and broke before reaching the sill. "Some days," she said. "Tonight, perhaps." He took the letter from his coat and laid it with her copies. He did not sit. The need to move, to stand in a way that made one ready, lived in him tonight like a second spine. He walked to the far wall and back, then stopped near her. Not too near, because the small room made nearness count twice. "You are alone," he said. It came out rougher than he meant. "You have been watching shadows and teaching your hands to be quiet with latches and pins." "I have lived as if my neighbors were always half listening," she said. "Because they are. It keeps them alive." "And me," he said. "I have lived as if the walls themselves listen." "They do," she said. No pity, just recognition. The room quieted. The slow drip from some unseen seam found its rhythm and kept it. He looked at the pressed violet, and saw with a clarity that startled him how something once gathered in a field could outlast the moment it had been made for simply by being held between the right pages. "You came to the cathedral to be seen," he said. "Yes." "By me." "Yes." "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Speak as plainly as you have ever spoken." She took a long breath and let it out in a way that said she was laying aside caution not because she wanted to, but because she respected what words could do when they ran true. "Take this into a room where silence cannot smother it," she said. "Do not let it be fed into the backfires and burned before breakfast like old receipts. Let those who must answer, answer, not with a private sorrow and a private narrowing of privilege, but with the sort of admission that untangles knots without cutting the rope in two." "And you," he asked, "what would become of you in this righted room?" "I am not a piece to be placed," she said, and the little heat in her voice was not for him, but for the dull habit of being handled by arrangements. "If my father's name is cleared, if I can stand in a market without feeling someone's pity turned like a blade at my back, the rest will sort itself, or it will not. But I will not have been useful to wrong men." He stared at the bundle of papers and thought of the first time he had watched his father sign his name. How seriousness had become beautiful, because a hand had moved ink with intention. He thought of the list of names in the smaller script and the instruction written at the bottom in his father's own hand, the one line that had made his heart ring like a struck glass, kept from the child until fit to bear it. He felt very old and very young at once. He turned away. He hated the sting in his eyes and cherished it, because it meant something right was happening inside the very man his tutors had spent years making useful. He put his hand flat on the cold table as if to steady it, and found her hand there, also flat, waiting. He did not cover it. He let his fingers, damp and cold, lie near enough that heat could cross without scandal. "Clara," he said. She closed her eyes at the sound of her name on his tongue. The name made a space in the room that had not existed before. It made the drying ropes and wooden pegs into witnesses who would keep their word. "If I do this," he said, "there will be cost. For you. For me. For—" She stopped short of saying for the crown, as if she had no right and needed none to say it. "You understand," he said. "I understand only what it has cost to carry it to this door," she said. "The rest is yours to live." "And I will live it," he said, and the sentence settled into him like a key turned once and fully. Silence again. But it was different now, dressed in decision. He heard the men's voices somewhere far off, turned the other way by a wrong guess or a closed gate. He heard the city coming out of the night, fires wakening behind shutters, wheels beginning to move. She went to the window and wiped a circle in the fog with the edge of her sleeve. The damp made a clean line. She looked out at the canal's dark surface and the way it carried a thin scum of rain that made patterns like handwriting. When she spoke again, she did not turn. "What will you say to them," she asked, "when you carry it into the room where men make tales sound like reason?" He answered with a stillness that owed nothing to training. "That my father trusted me," he said, "and that I intend to be worthy of his trust by trusting the truth that arrived before I called for it." She turned back. Her mouth softened. Not a smile. Something stranger and rarer that had to do with respect. She came closer, stopping when the closeness would have asked for more than either of them ought to give the night. "You are not alone," she said. He nodded, because he had felt alone in ways a crowded household never cures, and tonight, under damp ropes and the scent of lie, he did not. "Then we will go from here together," he said. "To where?" she asked, and for the first time since the chapel, there was humor under the question, wry and small and a little tired, like a fire banked, but not cold. "To the next right door," he said, "and the next after that, until the room we need opens." The laundry lines creaked as a small draft worked along the roof. He reached for the prayer book and closed it gently, the violet safe between sheets. He slid the vellum back into his coat with the care of someone replacing a heartbeat. He checked the bolt on the door, then looked up at the small pane again. "We wait until their noise goes farther," he said. "Then we take the canal's edge back toward the roads that do not shout our names." She nodded. "I know the quiet ways." "I will follow them," he said, and the words carried more meaning than the map they described. They stood without touching, and let the room learn the shape of silence two people can make when they have decided the same thing. The city took a breath. So did they. The rain tapped once more, and then weakened. She lifted the prayer book. He held the door bolt in his palm and felt its cool weight. Nights end as poorly as they begin, or they end with the stubbornness of people who refuse to be moved from a right line. "We go when you choose it," he said, because it mattered. She listened, head bent, eyes half closed, to footsteps that were and were not coming. "Now," she said at last, and looked at him with a steadiness that felt like a vow. "We go now." The service door took them in with the hush reserved for those who work before the city wakes. Stone swallowed their steps. The corridor smelled of damp leather, beeswax, and the faint, comforting bitterness of tea rising from lower kitchens. A messenger waited in the half-light, a sober man whose discretion had been tested in harder hours than this. He bowed to the prince and did not show surprise at the sight of the young woman at his side. "Arranged," he said, voice kept small for the stone. "The council room by the inner court. Those you asked for. Quietly." Edward inclined his head. A current in him, fierce, cold, clear, pulled toward that room as the tide pulls to a moon it cannot see. He felt Clara move with him, step for step, the prayer book held close, the ribbon dark from rain and touch. The letter lay against his ribs like a hot coal wrapped in cloth. They passed maps in gilt frames and chairs drawn back from last night's wakeful meetings. The palace had its own weather, the draft at a corner, the echo under a chandelier, the way old wood breathed when people entered a room expecting to be changed. A footman opened the chosen door and vanished into stillness. The room was practical rather than grand. A long table, windows to a narrow court where wet flagstones collected the morning. A clock ticked, punctuating restraint. The Queen Mother sat at the head, composed. The fatigue of a funeral day and night settled at the corners of her mouth without dimming the clarity in her eyes. The Archbishop stood near the mantel with a hand folded over the other, as if to teach his body to be quiet. Two ministers, men who could add a column and read a face, took their seats with the care of those who know which chair becomes a statement. A clerk waited at the table's end, quill ready, ink settled, sand for drying. Edward did not make them wait. He drew out the vellum, unwrapped it, and laid the late king's letter upon the wood. He placed beside it the list of names and sums, the copies from Clara's father's hand, and the small stack of receipts that made the trail undeniable. He set the prayer book beside them, the pressed violet housed within like a held breath. Then he stood straight and felt every eye measure the fact that he had brought a common woman into a room where men weighed the realm's peace. "Majesty," he said to his mother, not in the son's voice, and not as a minister, but as both. "I ask that we read." Her gaze fell to the seal, broken and kept. She touched it with 2 fingers, briefly, as one might touch a keepsake in a pocket while listening to bad news. She nodded. The Archbishop stepped forward. A minister reached for the first page and began to read in a voice trained to make sense without adornment. Names, dates, sums, the quiet arithmetic of betrayal. The smaller hand in the margins explaining how a figure that should have landed in the privy purse had instead been set to work bending men into a shape that looked like compliance and felt like theft. The Archbishop's lips pursed when the annotations made the purpose too plain to call confusion. The Queen Mother's hands rested on the table, as if to keep it still under a tremor. The clerk's quill trembled only when his breath did. At last, the minister stopped. He set the last paper down as one sets down a thing that wants to burn and cannot be allowed to. Silence. Edward let it stretch. Silence has a weight, and if you pour words in too soon, you lose the measure of it. It will be said, the Archbishop began, cautious as if the air would break, that the moment is cruel. The people are raw. They want assurance, not scandal. They want honesty, the Queen Mother said, without heat, and the respect of being told what touches them. A minister cleared his throat, more out of habit than need. We can contain, discipline, quietly return what must be returned. The realm need not swallow the whole of this at one gulp. Edward watched his mother's profile, the fine bone and the determined line taught by grief and power. He watched the Archbishop weigh what sin is and what confession does to it. He watched the men who had learned how to keep the fabric from tearing consider whether they were patching a gown or hiding a wound. He did not look at Clara yet. He kept her presence in his peripheral sense, like heat kept near the hands in winter. He spoke carefully, not to please any one person, and not to offend the room, but to address the truth that had walked into the palace without asking leave. My father trusted me. He placed his fingertips on the edge of the letter. He trusted that when I could bear it, I would bear this. I do not take that confidence as permission to perform grief in public and resolve sin in private. We will be measured by whether we are willing to be seen doing what is right. The Archbishop's mouth softened a fraction, a sign so small it would vanish for anyone who had not watched men find courage by degrees. The Queen Mother's gaze lifted and settled on her son. A silence passed like a hand across a brow, cool, clarifying. Edward turned at last to the young woman who had stepped into the cathedral's shadow and made the day turn. Miss Whitlow, he said, giving her the courtesy of acknowledgement in a place that had not planned for it. Will you tell this room the truth as you have lived it? Clara did not clasp her hands to look meek or fold herself into apology. She set the prayer book on the table before her with its ribbon straight and the violet protected, and spoke in the plain cadence of someone who had trained her tongue to be exact. My father made fair copies, she said. When your father's strength could not hold long meetings, my father kept the numbers from becoming fog. He saw where the sums wandered and called it wandering only as long as a gentleman will call theft confusion. He wrote the names and the dates. He hid nothing except for your sake. Her eyes went to the seal, then to Edward's face. He told me, if the wrong hands came for the papers, to burn what would put the innocent in danger and keep what would make the guilty look like themselves. He taught me that Providence will use poor hands if it must. Her voice did not fail on the word poor. It made the room listen harder. They came, she continued, not with cudgels, but with promises. Work, bread, a roof. Private comfort to keep public peace. She looked at the Archbishop when she said it, not accusing, but showing him the underside of words he used to bless the world. I held. I brought it where it would not be buried under polite penance. That is all. There was a quiet that was not empty. The Queen Mother looked at the prayer book with its pressed flower and saw that it was not a prop, but a life. She looked at Clara's hands and saw ink in the lines. She looked at her son and saw how his posture had changed in a day and how it had not. A boy gone rigid under expectation become a man made lithe by duty. What would you have us do? She asked Edward, not as a challenge, but as a test neither kind nor cruel, merely necessary. He did not use the advantage of being asked to fetch himself a throne cleaner of difficulty than fate allows. He did not ask to be loved for the courage he was about to take in borrowed light. He answered like a man who expects to be held to his words. Restore, he said. Return what was taken. Name who did it. Make plain what was planned, around and not against the crown. Give the people the dignity of a true announcement rather than the corrosive mercy of rumor. And he looked at Clara now, without blinking away the dangerous human thing that had entered with her. Clear the name of the man who carried this for us when we refused to carry it ourselves. The Archbishop drew breath as if to measure the pain of such exposure and found instead a kind of relief that his sermon voice rarely delivered him. "Confession in daylight," he murmured. "Bitter to the lips, better for the body." The minister, who had offered quiet discipline, looked down, studied his empty hands, and nodded once. There was a certain kind of courage in conceding quickly. The room took note without ceremony. The Queen Mother did not pretend the consequence would be simple. She folded her hands and made a small decision into a large one with the ease of a woman who has combined housekeeping and power all her life. "So be it," she said. "We will speak at noon before anyone else builds the tale wrongly. It will say what must be said and no more. And it will say," her gaze moved to Clara like a benediction that did not condescend, "that William Whitlow died in loyalty and leaves a daughter as witness to that loyalty." Clara's held breath eased out of her, so softly it felt like a bird released from a closed hand. The clerk dipped his quill and began to write, his careful loops and slashes catching the shape of the decision before it could fade. The Archbishop nodded to himself, composing words even he would prefer not to speak, and grateful to be required to say them anyway. The ministers looked at the list again as if numbers could become less damning if examined twice, and accepted they could not. Edward reached for the prayer book. He did not have to ask to touch it. He did not have the right to take it. He turned it toward him without lifting it, and ran a fingertip along the pressed violet's edge, a gesture that should have meant nothing and meant everything. Then he placed his hand on the table near Clara's, not covering, not claiming, announcing. It mattered who saw it. The Queen Mother did. The Archbishop did. The clerk saw and pretended not to. The ministers saw and did the mathematics of what it meant for their lives, and for the palace's future quiet. "Your Royal Highness," the Archbishop said carefully, "you will be asked, today and the day after, why she stands in this room." "Because she belongs here," Edward said, as simply as any oath he had ever taken. "Because without her my name would be a lie." It was dangerous. It was unadorned. It was entirely true. The Queen Mother's mouth softened. 1,000 small male calculations took place across from her, and she allowed them their gouty dignity, but she took the liberty her age and station had earned to be moved by something as unfashionable as gratitude. "Miss Whitlow," she said, "you will sit with me when we speak. I do not ask you to speak aloud. Your presence will be enough." Clara bowed her head, not to the crown, even that would have been mere habit, but to the justice of being seen. "Majesty," Edward said, turning slightly toward his mother, "I have another thing to lay before you." He could feel the air shift. Every man who lives by turning rooms held his breath. "I will not hide behind the truth we tell," he said. "I will not let it be said that I used her courage and sent her back to obscurity when I had no further need. I intend to honor her publicly for what she has done. Not with money alone, as if her use were a trade, but with the acknowledgement that she stands beside the truth that will gird our house." The Archbishop inclined his head in a way that managed both surprise and doctrinal relief. "Such acknowledgement would set a strong example," he said dryly, guarding the easier words and keeping his approval inside them. The Queen Mother looked from son to woman and back and read the current that had only begun to name itself. She thought of the cost of letting love into a palace that survives by parapets. She weighed fear against the disrespect of refusing what was clearly worthy. She made a mother's choice and a queen's at once. "Be steady," she said low, only for her son. "Be willing to wear the cost. Then ask what you mean to ask." He nodded. He had no habit of asking for anything that mattered. It felt, for a breath, like a boy crossing a floor to say a thing to his father too important to whisper. He stepped toward Clara and did not reach for her. He addressed the room, and through it, the nation, through a sentence spoken to one person. "I claim her as ally, and as the measure by which you will read my reign," he said. "I will be judged by whether I stood with truth when it walked into the nave uninvited." Clara's throat moved. The prayer book rose and fell with her breath. She met his eyes because he had spoken to her and to others at once, and she would not allow fear of either to lower her gaze. "You speak in large rooms," she said quietly. "I live in small ones. If we are to stand in both, let there be only one version of us." "Only one," he answered, and the Archbishop's hand loosened on his other hand, a sign no one but an old friend would have read. Footsteps in the corridor grew into a soft commotion. The palace was waking fully. Messages had flown. Expectations gathered like clouds. The Queen Mother stood. The room rose with her. She nodded to the clerk, who dusted the fresh words with sand and blew lightly until they set. The Archbishop adjusted nothing on his cassock and considered this an act of contrition of a sort. "Walk with me," the Queen Mother said to Clara. It was not an order. It was permission to be visible. Clara took the offered step. They moved not into the great hall, not yet, but into a smaller chamber where messengers could be guided and wild rumor domesticated. The ministers went ahead to prepare the right faces in the right places. The Archbishop spoke low to a chaplain about bells and thanksgiving and the language that makes humiliation into repentance without dressing it too finely. Edward and Clara walked in the wake of all that machinery. He felt the tilt of the palace under his soles. He felt how a life could become something terrible and fine at once in a single morning. He looked at her profile, austere and tender, and wanted nothing in that moment but to keep her from harm and keep her near, two desires that have never gotten along and never will. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice pitched under the tread of staff and shoe. "Yes," she said, "but I would be more afraid if I went home." He almost smiled. Courage is not a mood. It is a decision without a better option. They entered the antechamber, where those who wait can see the door through which fate will come. The inner court beyond the windows had shaken the last of the rain into the gravel. A band in the distance tuned as discreetly as a band can. The Archbishop sent a brief message to the bell ringers, not for a funeral, but for a service where the word thanksgiving did not taste like triumph, only relief. The Queen Mother turned. "When we go in," she said, including them both in the pronoun without fuss, "we speak plainly. No pieties, no adornment." "Plain words are all I have," Clara said. "They will be enough," Edward answered. He reached for the prayer book. "May I?" he asked, not out of habit, but because ceremony should begin with courtesy if it wants to end with truth. She placed it in his hands. He opened it, and with a care that felt like a vow, lifted the pressed violet free. It lay in his palm, ghost of a field, stubborn, tender. He closed her fingers around it, skin against skin for the first time without the shield of panic. Heat passed between them like a secret that would not stay secret long. "Keep it," he said. "When they ask what we built this on, you will have an answer small enough to fit in a hand." She did not speak. Her eyes moved only once, to his mouth, and back to his eyes in time to be decorous. He felt her breath, steadier than his own. The Archbishop looked away, occupied with his papers an instant longer than necessary. He was a man who understood privacy because he had spent his life invading it for a living. The Chamberlain's voice sounded at the inner door. The court arranged itself. The Queen Mother lifted her chin and walked through, Clara at her side. Edward followed, carrying the prayer book and the letter at once, the two halves of a truth united at last. The room received them. Not the great many, not yet, but enough to begin a tide. Ministers, clerks, messengers, a small cluster of nobles whose presence in any room signaled that the other rooms would hear soon. The Archbishop took his place. A chaplain set the bell schedule in motion with a nod. The Queen Mother spoke first. She said what happened without defensive music. She named the pattern without pretending it was unusual. She called men to repentance by name where the paper allowed it, and by office where charity required. She announced the restitution and the public accounting. It was bracing. It was merciful. It was what power looks like when it has decided not to hide. Edward stepped forward. He did not read. He did not need to. "My father gave me this letter to carry when I could," he said. "A citizen of this city carried it for me until I was fit. I will not forget either fact. When I swear in future to govern with honor, you may judge me by this morning." He turned then, while eyes were hot on him, and made the gesture no one expected to see so soon and everyone would remember. He offered Clara his hand, not as a rescuer to a rescued, not as a prince to a petitioner, but as a man to the person who had made him honest in front of his own house. She put her hand in his. It was as simple as two hands finding their purpose. The room, built to amplify everything false, amplified this too, and made it sound like a vow. The Archbishop's voice, when it came, carried blessing without sanctimony. "May truth be your guard," he said, and for once his words felt like a wall that does not keep love out, only keeps cowards from climbing in. The bells began, not funeral, not triumph, but clear, untangled notes that told the city something had been set right. The sound came in through the windows and hung in the air as if the stone remembered a better use for ringing. When the formal words were done, the Queen Mother stepped forward and kissed Clara's cheek, a mother's gesture given before a court that had seen too many calculations dressed as affection. She did it in full view, so no one could pretend later that the girl had been smuggled in and out between scandals. Clara stood very still, steady as the violet in her palm. Edward leaned a fraction closer, the better to catch a sentence that mattered more to him than the morning's proclamations. "Can you bear this?" he asked, the last private question before the noise took them. "With you," she said, not loudly, not as a promise trapped in a room, but as the present tense that makes futures possible. He bowed his head once, not to hide feeling, but to honor it. He straightened and laughed, just under his breath, at the relief of saying nothing more. He guided her toward the window where the bells could be heard best, and the light touched the violet like a fresh bruise turned to beauty. The court, that multiplication of eyes, watched two people stand at a casement with open hands, and did not quite find the words to be cynical about it. The Archbishop closed his book and let the sound do the rest. The Queen Mother sat, shoulders easing, as if a room had been righted after a long tilt. The bells kept ringing. They would stop. Another day would come with its ledgers and its habits. But for a measured while, the palace and the city shared the simple cadence of clear metal meeting open air, and in that sound, a prince and a humble young woman stood together, the prayer book between them, like a signed compact, the pressed violet safe in her palm, where a kingdom could see what dignity looks like when it is not a costume, but a choice. Thank you so much for listening to this story, all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.